Life is fragile. It's a fact we're learning in real time, every day. What we once called normal has seemingly disappeared. There's uncertainty in the air, restlessness in our hearts. Things we once took for granted are becoming difficult to find. Our usual day-to-day has evolved into this odd chaos. Peace is becoming obsolete. Many have lost jobs, security, and those they love. The pain is undeniable. But what if our fragility caused us to lean harder into God? What if, in our weakness, we chose to rely more on His strength? Would our outlook change? Would the peace that passes understanding begin to drown out the noise of this moment? Would we walk in a quiet confidence, knowing our God is mighty to save? We're not promised tomorrow, but we are given a simple truth to stand on. Our God goes before us. He will never leave us. He will never forsake us. Yes, life is fragile. But in our weakness, He is strong.
This is a reading of Paul preaching to the Athenians from the 17th chapter of the book of Acts. Then Paul stood in front of the Areopagus and said, "Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription, 'To an unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, He is the Lord of heaven and earth. Does not live in shrines made by human hands, nor is He served by human hands as though He needed anything, since He Himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. From one ancestor, He made all nations to inhabit the earth, and He allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God and perhaps grope for Him and find Him. Though indeed He is not far from each of us. For in Him we live and move and have our being. As even some of your own poets have said, for we too are His offspring. Since we are God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of mortals. While God has overlooked the times of human ignorance, now He commands all people everywhere to repent, because He has fixed a day on which He will have the world judged in righteousness by a man He has appointed. And of this He has given assurance to all by raising Him from the dead." Friends, this is the word of our Lord. Thanks be to God. If you need some good news, I have good news for you. I'm sick and tired of turning on the news these days and finding only stories of pain and suffering and everything else, which I know probably sells, but things are heavy enough. Well, the good news is this. John Krasinski, an actor who has gone on to do much more than his initial role and has become quite a star in his own right, was Jim in The Office, which is a comedy from several years ago. Well, he has teamed up with a bunch of friends and he has started an at-home news service where he shows up in shorts and puts a blazer on and goes and tells stories about signs of hope and beauty and new life going on in the world around us. Everyday people making a difference. One of his most recent episodes, he puts on a graduation ceremony for people that are going to be missing it. And one of the most beautiful elements was he gave people the opportunity to write a question they wanted answered by somebody, and then he surprised them with a graduation speaker, someone that would connect deeply with their interests and what they've been doing. And one of the most poignant, and it's no surprise, was Oprah. Oprah Winfrey was selected to be the graduation speaker and conversant with a young woman who is the first youth national poet laureate in the United States. She is graduating from Harvard. And as the two of them were speaking, Oprah pointed to a time in her own life that had been especially dark, but that opened the door for everything else to happen. And she recalls having a conversation with Maya Angelou, who had been early in her career a mentor and a guide and a friend. And Maya, during one of these dark times, told Oprah, or Oprah related, that God always puts a rainbow in the sky. And this is a signal that even when the storms of life are going around us, look for God's presence, because there's always still beauty in the midst of it all. And to kind of bring it down to ground level for this young woman, Oprah then went on to say that imagine you're taking off during a storm, you're taking flight during a storm. And she retold the kind of story, and so I'll paraphrase it for you, but she says, you're on the tarmac and everything's dark and it's raining, there's clouds, it's all gray. But within moments of taking off, the plane breaks through the clouds and there it is, the sky, the sun is shining. It is blue. It was there all along, but just obscured by the conditions that were directly in front of you. In our story today, Paul seems to be doing something very similar to this. I would go as far as to say that Paul, yes, is preaching gospel to the people in Athens. That's absolutely going on. But it's the way he speaks, it's the way he addresses them that is in itself an act of good news. And here's what I mean. Okay, so he directly quotes two poets who are Stoics from Greek culture who had written hymns to Zeus that then he directly quotes. Now, here's what's so absolutely wonderful about all this. He takes their language, he takes their concepts, he takes their way of thinking and says, I was walking through this fine, beautiful city of yours, and I saw a shrine to an unknown God. Now, let me tell you, this unknown that you have perceived but not understood, let me tell you about this God. And then he lays out and describes the very spirit of a God that lives and dwells in all things, that doesn't need to be given offerings in the traditional sense, because this is the God who offers for us, that cares for us, that sustains us, that gives us the very breath we breathe, that has laid out all the nations across the world in such a way that even when they don't know this God, they grasp and grope to understand. He lays all this out. And there are two beautiful lines in it that wind up over the ages, finding their way because of this sermon that he preaches in 17 into a prayer that St. Augustine in the 5th century writes down, that then gets picked up and used over and over and over again throughout all of Christian history. There is this thread of understanding that even these people that were the highest minds of philosophy of their age, he is saying, you have already perceived something, hoped for something, dreamt of something, but never seen it. And the beauty in the act of grace that Paul gives to them is to point it out and say, this is the God of whom I speak. And not a God amongst many. But those direct quotes were being used to say this, that you lifted up to Zeus. That's okay. That's great. He's your biggest guy. But this unknown God is far beyond what you're even calling Zeus. He's giving them the opportunity to see something of beauty going on in the world that has been missed. I think this is really, at its depths, something that we need in our lives right now. There is so much beauty in the world going on right now. I mean, from where I sit right now, I can see flowering dogwoods. I can see a bright blue sky coming in through the window. I can see all of nature waking up again, despite the fact that normal seems to be obliterated. And that the new normal feels heavier, feels drawn out, feels lonelier, more isolated. We need to be able to see something, to have something pointed out to us about the presence of God even in this moment. You know, there's a famous piece of artwork that was done as part of the altar screen in one of the cathedrals in Germany years and years and years ago during the Middle Ages. And it shows John the Baptist pointing to Christ. And when you look at his finger, it's a disproportionately long finger, almost just like a pointer. And he's pointing back to the cross of Christ as the very center of Christian being. For centuries, this has been used to be able to help explain to people part of the role, part of the life of being a person of faith is to point back to Christ. Paul does it in his sermon today. He points back to Christ and says, this same God that you have known of to be unknown, that you've been able to name might be there, but you haven't been able to perceive, this same God is the one who has been patient through ignorance. But the time of judging, of understanding, of taking the toll is coming. And the one who has been chosen to do all of this was shown to us in the world by a sign of being brought to new life. Now, outside of the reading today, we hear that some scoff and some get it and come on over. But the important piece that comes out of this is Paul is pointing always back to Jesus Christ. He is pointing to a beauty in the world of love that not even death can overcome. So what is our calling? I'm going to use that big word. What is our calling in this time? Well, for me, what I get excited about is that we have this opportunity to point now to our friends, our families, to let our everyday moments to be a pointing back to not some man who was crucified and we believe to have been risen by God, but that in the very act of Jesus' ministry, his life, the way that he went through his arrest, through his trial, through his killing, every step was a pointing back to something that lies deeper than the truth that sits on the surface. Something that is more real than that which we face in our everyday lives is still going on again, breaking through the clouds to see that the sky, the sun, the beauty of the world has always still been there. Now, some of you may be aware that my dad is also a pastor. He's in a retirement now, kicking up and having fun with an interim position right now at a church. But before he did all that, he wrote a book a few years ago talking about what it means to be reformed now in this day and age. And there's this wonderful, beautiful phrase that he uses in there saying that what he sees to be part of our faith, or the driving force of our faith in this day and age, is to be what he called docents in the house of wonder. That's a beautiful line. But the reason I'm bringing it up here is twofold. First of all, if you've ever gone to a museum or an art gallery or something, even if you were drugged there, if somebody guides you around and starts telling the stories of individual pieces of art or maybe an artifact or something along those lines, it comes to life in a way that it never would if you just walked up by yourself and stood there and saw it. They give us a window into seeing the deeper nature of something. These docents allow for us to understood that which would have been missed otherwise. Now, the second reason I'm bringing it up today is that not only is it a memorable phrase, but wonder itself, this idea of being docents in the house of wonder, it feels a little far-fetched right now. At this moment, it feels a little far-fetched. With everything going on with this health crisis and the economic disaster that seems to be looming with so much unemployment rising at this time. Wonder doesn't seem like the word we should be using. And ironically, I think that's exactly why we need to use it. We get to be the people who point beyond the clouds, who show that beyond those clouds is a sun that is still shining bright, a sky that is blue, that there is beauty even in the moment now. I needed this last week. I was out in the front yard, and my wife, kids, the dog, they were getting ready to go on a walk together. And a friend from this congregation, a member of our church who lives in the neighborhood around the corner from us, was out riding her bike. And she, again, maintaining social distancing, she stopped her bike and we had a conversation for a while. And she said exactly what I needed to hear. This time has been tough on all of us. What I've noticed has been tough for me has been the juggling of all the demands of trying to care for this church, of trying to help our leaders find ways of moving forward, of trying to find ways of doing church as a community and holding that together, with being the spouse that I want to be and being the father I want to be. And I've been noticing that this has been so hard on my own children. Conflict seems to spark much more easily, and their own tender feelings are much more frayed than normal. So we're standing out on the lawn, and I'm trying to busy myself at this point. The children are going to go for a walk, and I'm trying to busy myself with the front garden. I didn't have a lot of time, but I had some time to dig up an Andromeda bush that's in the front that needed to go to the back. And this friend from the congregation just says, one of the weird things about this whole crisis is that my children have become so much closer. And at first I thought, our children got closer in all this. Because all I was able to see was the conflict. But what she pointed out was, my children have become so much closer. And yes, that means that they're sparked a little bit more quickly, that they are triggered a little bit more quickly, they get into conflict and fights a little bit more quickly. She said, but that's because they're closer. And yes, we're living in tight quarters, but they're closer. So for her, the symptom of being close was the fact that these children are getting sparked a little bit more easily with each other, that they are finding it a little easier to be set off. And that was a sign of closeness and beauty. Where I was seeing only the clouds from the ground level, she saw the clouds. She saw them. But she knew what was really happening above that. She saw the rainbow in the sky, if you will, to go back to that Maya Angelou quote. I am so excited about our opportunity as people of faith to be able to go out into the world, and for every day we have these opportunities, these chances, every encounter that we have to remind people of what lies on the other side of these clouds. of moments in our own life of beauty, of moments in our own life where we have seen the very presence of God. It could have been a phone call from a friend that came out of the blue. It could have been a member of this church reaching out to say, "Hey, how are you?" One of our deacons or an elder or just a friend. It may be the chance to sit down and be, through social media or whatever, to reach out to a family member or a friend that you haven't seen in a while. That in this time of such instability and so much fear, where have you seen the presence of this God that Paul tells us is right there amongst us all the time, closer to us than our own breath? This one in whom Paul says, again quoting Greek poets, in whom we live and move and have our being. I reflect on this and think that there's just so much. There is so much that goes unseen. And how can we be those who point it out for others, who allow for faith and hope and love to rebloom in our neighborhoods and amongst our houses and our friends by simply pointing out what otherwise would have been missed? And in all this, I give thanks. I give thanks to God. I give thanks to Paul for reminding us of it. And I give thanks to you, dear friends, for the many ways in which you bring grace and love into this world. Peace be with you, and amen. So let me ask you, how will you let your life speak this week during this time of crisis? How will your life be a sign of hope, of love, of faith? How will you allow your life to become proclamation of good news for someone else? And we've heard how the church itself as a community can create sanctuary for people. We've heard ways in which the church itself and all of us in it can point out in daily life that which so often goes missed. The ways in which God's presence is at work in ways that are too often ignored. I ask also what it means to love your neighbor in this time. Instead of it being a telling of what they are missing, it might be pointing out the beauty that you see, giving them the opportunity to see it as well. It can also be giving them the gift of seeing something within them that they have failed to see themselves. Some sort of beauty that is part of who their character is, that has gone missed or been hidden under the pain, the rubble of this new normal in which we live. This week, for the time of the offering, I ask that you spend just a little time thinking and considering how your life is a gift for others. How what you see can be a gift for someone else, a spark of life for them. As we get ready to prepare for the end of our time of worship here and prepare to worship in our lives for the everyday that we face and to live our lives as an act of offering for the rest of the world. In this moment, how will you extend peace beyond the comments section, where I hope you will begin sharing hellos and how are yous and peace be with yous with friends of yours here in this church? But how are you extending that peace in your everyday? How does every day become an act of worship, of proclamation, of standing your ground to say there is so much beauty despite what we might see around us? How will you let your life speak?